The Seahawks invested a lot of draft picks and free agent money trying to shore up their defense. How do things look on that side of the ball through the 2025 season? Rob Rang and I'll be digging in on a 3-year plan for the Seahawks on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be rejoined by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang, and a special thanks to all the 12s out there, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. Only 2 OTAs left for the Seahawks, and they're just the passing clinics, mostly young players. They're doing some canoeing out on Lake Washington as well. So we have reached that stage of the offseason, and that means it's on to training camp. We're going to be continuing our series, checking out the 3-year plan, the 3-year outlook for the Seahawks. We're going to shift to the defensive side of the football, and then we're going to continue our 90-player countdown. We kicked it off yesterday. We'll have numbers 85 through 81 today. Some really fun players, including an XFL all first team selection staying in the Pacific Northwest. So some fun players that we'll be looking at. Without further ado, let's get started. Now for your lead story here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. John Schneider and the front office for the Seahawks, like every other front office out there, they have to keep an eye on the present, and they also have to keep another eye on the future when they're making their roster decisions. And I was able to start diving onto this, Rob, yesterday, looking at offense. Today, though, we're going to shift to the side of the football where the Seahawks had more pressing questions going into the offseason, and that obviously was on defense. They struggled to defend the run. The pass rush was inconsistent. The secondary was good for the most part, but there were some hiccups in there as well for the back part of the defense, and they had some injuries back there. From a 3-year perspective, though, thinking big picture here, where do you think the Seahawks, based on what they've done this offseason, have helped themselves the most, not just this year, but looking at the next couple seasons after?
Well, one of the reasons why I was absolutely shocked, Corbin, when the Seahawks made that selection of Devin Witherspoon, number 5 overall selection, was that cornerback, because I did view that as a position that the Seahawks were relatively strong already. Of course, it's always fun when you take a position of strength and make it a position that is arguably the best in all of the NFL. And so that's the position that I would have to highlight first. I think you could also make an argument at the safety position, just considering what safety could be if you have the full gamut of Quandre Diggs as that center fielder, Jamal Adams coming up and being kind of that pass rushing linebacker hybrid type of players, and of course the free agent addition of Julian Love being able to kind of make it all work together. So really the easy answer here, Corbin, is I really think that the strength of Seattle's defense is absolutely in the secondary, just like it was when the Legion of Boom helped the Seahawks obviously bring a Lombardi trophy to Seattle.
Those of you that are watching on YouTube, you can see the 3-year depth chart on defense for the Seahawks, and there's a lot of green, which is good. That means that the Seahawks have projected starters on the roster for the next 2 or 3 seasons, but there are a couple of glaring red spots as well, particularly at linebacker, where they don't have a projected starter under contract after the 2023 season. They also, at the punter position, Michael Dixon's only got 2 years left on his contract. I think when you look from a big picture perspective, though, I think that, and we'll talk some more about this as the show progresses, the defensive line is still an area of concern, or at least an area of question for the Seahawks with all the moving parts. But they did give themselves some continuity there, which, quite frankly, there hasn't been much of that the last couple of years. They've kind of been mixing and matching their 3 techs, their defensive tackles, bringing in guys like Quentin Jefferson for second stints, bringing Al Woods back in for a second stint. They haven't necessarily had core guys that they've retained in that interior defensive line. They let Jarran Reed go. Now Jarran Reed's back. But Dre'Mont Jones getting that big 3-year contract worth over $50 million. Maybe you can look at the amount of money and say, hey, we might have overreached a little bit price-wise, but this is a guy that has consistently gotten after quarterbacks. He's still in his mid-20s, still has room to get better than what he has been at this point. And now you have him under contract for the next 3 years. So you can look at some other parts of that defensive line, and we'll obviously get to that later, but you can question those things at the same time. You can look at Dre'Mont Jones signing and say, hey, we just invested big money here in a guy that can be a cornerstone for our defense. And they just haven't had that kind of player in the interior defensive line the last 4 or 5 years. They just haven't made those kind of investments, or they haven't been able to get young guys developed enough to be that. So that's really what jumps out to me more than anything, is that you do have players like Julian Love. Even you got him on a 2-year deal. It wasn't one of those 1-year flyers. So it does give you more flexibility in 2024, having him on the roster. It feels like there's a lot more clarity, at least in terms of continuity, than what there was going into this offseason, where there really wasn't much away from maybe a handful of positions. Offense was much more clear cut going into the offseason. So I do think the Seahawks, and we'll have more time to expand on this, but it does feel like they have been able to fill some of those gaps, not just getting 1-year stop gaps like they've relied on a lot of the time the last 4 or 5 seasons. They were able to get some guys that may potentially be long-term answers, or players like Dre'Mont Jones, where you better be a long-term answer with the money that we're paying you.
Yeah, exactly. And to me, it reminds me a little bit of what Seattle did a year ago. There was a lot of people out there who were kind of surprised, maybe a little bit concerned when Seattle signed Uchenna Nwosu. I mean, after all, the Chargers had basically replaced him, with Khalil Mack, and obviously previously with Joey Bosa there. And yet it was one of the moves that I really celebrated. I really thought that Uchenna Nwosu was a player that was kind of on the upswing, and that you wanted to sign him, not just to that 1-year prove it deal, but to a 2 or 3-year contract, because I personally thought that he had already demonstrated starting level ability, but also had upside to him. I mention it because to me, it's very similar with Dre'Mont Jones, very similar with Julian Love as well, in that I see players that are already good, but I still believe they can have even higher upside. So I applaud the Seahawks, frankly, for taking a little bit more of a long-term approach with these particular free agents, as opposed to some of the other free agents out there that maybe are a little bit more of a 1-year gamble. Let's see what you can do. So to me, that it really is, again, one of the areas in which I was excited about the additions that Seattle made during the offseason, especially with Dre'Mont Jones. Obviously, their splashiest player from just the number of dollars that the Seahawks gave him. But of course, the free agent addition on the defensive side of the ball that most Seahawks fans are the most excited about is just the return of number 54, Bobby Wagner, in the middle. Yeah. And for anybody who was just watching the YouTube, watching on YouTube, and as you often say, Corbin, thank you so much to all of those who are watching on YouTube. But if you're not, the one area of red that is just glaring for the YouTube watchers and those of you who are not watching, I will just mention it that we are only listing right now 2 linebackers, Bobby Wagner and Jordan Brooks. Both of those players are under, basically 1-year deals at this point. Jordan Brooks coming in the final year of his rookie deal. Bobby Wagner brought back on a 1-year deal. There might be some out there saying, hey, what about Devin Bush? He's only on a 1-year deal. So again, I mean, linebacker position long-term is a position of concern. And that's one that I think that the Seahawks very much have to be watching, not only their current players, including some of those young players currently on the roster, but that has to be something that they are looking and paying a great deal of attention to with the 2024 NFL draft prep already starting, with scouts kind of starting to congregate, starting to kind of buzz a little bit about some of the prospects that might be available next spring.
As we've talked about time and time again on this podcast, there was a long run there for John Schneider where the Seahawks were signing a lot of 30-plus-year-old players to 1-year contracts. And when we were looking at these 3-year outlook depth charts, there was red everywhere because there was just not much long-term planning that was put into those rosters. It was win now. Let's get these 1-year guys that maybe don't have a ton left in the tank, but they can help us compete for championships. This is just a different time for the Seahawks, and seeing them aggressively spend free agent dollars on players like you mentioned that are in their mid-20s that still have room to get better and are in the prime of their careers. It's a really nice change-up that not only reflected on the field last year, they're hoping reflects this year, but you can see it just looking at the depth chart that, hey, we have these guys locked up from multiple seasons. We can really build something now, not just be a playoff team, but make ourselves contenders with some of these guys as foundational pieces. And so that makes it exciting. We're going to dig even deeper on this subject, looking at 3-year outlooks at specific position groups, which areas the Seahawks are best set up through 2025, where they have the most immediate concerns, and maybe a position group that's truly wait and see. Looking forward to diving into that up next year on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. As the NFL season quickly approaches, make sure to rush over to FanDuel, because right now new customers can get a no-sweat first bet up to $2,500. That's $2,500 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from season awards to week 1 props to exact regular season win totals in the NFL. Even with training camp still more than a month away, I'm excited to dig into season props such as NFL MVP, Geno Smith, anyone, Rookie of the Year, maybe Jackson Smith-Njigba. Regardless of what prop you choose, you'll get paid instantly if you win. There's no better place to bet on all the upcoming football action than America's #1 sportsbook. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and get a no-sweat first bet up to $2,500. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NFL. You're listening to the Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined once again by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. For our everydayers, you will not want to miss our Wednesday episode. Dan Viennes of the Seahawks Forever podcast going to be joining in to dish out his deep sleepers to watch heading into training camp, Geno Smith's ceiling, and much more. Going to be a really exciting episode. You won't want to miss it. Let's continue, Rob, to break down this 3-year outlook on defense for the Seahawks. We kind of took that big picture like we always do, that macro perspective. Let's just look at the depth chart as a whole. And now we get a chance to get into the specifics and talk about which position groups the Seahawks look like they're set at for the next 3 years, where the most immediate concerns come into play, and maybe a position or two that is kind of in that middle ground. Not sure if it's a concern or if this is going to be a strength. We have to wait and see. Let's start with the positives. And I know that you already mentioned Devin Witherspoon, so I'm sure that is where you are going to go first here. And that would be my #1 strength for this defense too, for a number of different reasons long-term.
Yeah, I think that just the fact that the Seattle went with Devin Witherspoon #5 overall, and then just watching him on tape, you and I both viewed him as a absolute top 10 lock in this last draft. And of course, Seattle made him the #5 overall selection. You just see the size, you see the physicality, you see the speed, you see the ball skills, you see the competitiveness, you see just the pure athletic ability that kind of goes back to his days as a high school basketball player. And that was one of the reasons why that the Florida native wound up at the University of Illinois in the first place. But anybody who has watched his tape sees what just a very well-rounded and highly competitive player that he is. And I think that that's the mindset that we have to focus in on here for just a moment, because anybody who has watched the Seahawks a year ago and just kind of was overjoyed, I presume, with the way that Tariq Woolen played as a 5th-round pick a year ago, considering how darn good Tariq Woolen was. And it was critical that Seattle had to find a guy who had the right mentality to play opposite Tariq Woolen. And now I would argue that they had a pretty solid veteran in Mike Jackson who did exactly that a year ago. But again, that's kind of more of a journeyman NFL player rather than an absolute superstar that the Seahawks clearly believe that Devin Witherspoon can be. So again, I think that I personally thought that cornerback was one of Seattle's areas of strength, even entering the draft. But I think it's really fun when you have an area of strength that you make absolutely elite. And that's what I do expect Seattle's cornerback play specifically to be. And I'm really encouraged by Seattle's talent at the safety position as well. So as I mentioned a couple of moments ago, from the macro perspective, I think you really have to focus in on Seattle's secondary as their greatest strength. The closer you get to the line of scrimmage, the more I start to get a little bit more trouble.
Yeah, that's something we're going to have time to talk about here in a second, but I'm glad that you mentioned Mike Jackson because he played pretty darn well in 17 starts last year. And Pete Carroll said that he had the best camp of anybody this offseason, borderline dominant. If you can be dominant in OTAs and minicamp, he was able to. He was getting his hands on the football for pass breakups, picked off Geno Smith in the end zone. That video has been flying around on social media. You've got Trey Brown, who showed he could start a couple years ago before he got hurt. Kobe Bryant played well last year. I mean, this is a team that doesn't just have star power at the top. They've got 5 starter caliber players at this position, and a number of them have 3 years remaining on their contract at day 3 cost. So they're affordable too. The only expensive player that you have here right now is Witherspoon being the top 5 pick, and that's still, $5 million cap hit this year. It's not like he's being paid shutdown quarter top money at this point. So that's why this is the biggest long-term strength to me is it's affordable. You've got the star power, and you've also got starters behind those guys that would start for a lot of teams, and they won't start for this football team with the addition of Devin Witherspoon. It's a good problem to have. As far as the other group that I view as a long-term, and I know you and I talked about this before the show, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts, because I don't think you completely agree with me on this, but edge and outside linebacker, I think from a long-term perspective, I'm actually more excited about than short-term. Uchenna Nwosu is going to be a free agent. That's the key here. Can you get him re-signed? But you've got untapped potential and upside with this group. Darrell Taylor, Boye Mafe, Derek Hall. We're talking players that are all 25, 26 years old or younger. They're still very young players that are under club control. Mafe and Hall, second-round picks, not expensive guys to have under contract the next 3 years. And then you've got the unknown variables. And I think this is why I have this group as one of my positives here. Tyreek Smith is technically going to be a rookie this year. He missed his first season in the league. They loved what they saw in his limited action in practice last year before he got put on injured reserve. They've been talking him up this offseason as well. And you're going to get Alton Robinson back at some point. There's still 2 guys there that the organization is high on that we don't even know if we can count on them to fit into this. If they do end up fitting into this rotation, you could have 6 very solid pass rushers working off the edge for this team, and it could be a strength. And again, almost all these guys are under contract for at least the next 2 years, if not the next 3. So I think from a long-term perspective that the edge position is actually a spot the Seahawks are in pretty good shape.
Could be. I mean, that's the problem. It's like you said. I mean, you're very intrigued about the long-term potential of the Seahawks pass rush, not quite as sure about the short-term potential, and that's my concern as well. If I was going to push back at all on this, I think that the edge rushers for the Seahawks could be as good as their cornerback class, and by that I mean it could be right there among the NFL's absolute best. I also think that there's a possibility that they've got a whole bunch of guys that are kind of more journeyman edge rushers rather than those dominant, those number one guys. I've used that baseball reference. You have to have your ace. You have to have your number one guy. I think there's a possibility Uchenna Nwosu gets 10 sacks. I think there's in this upcoming season. I think there's a possibility Darrell Taylor gets 10 sacks. I think that Derek Hall or Tyreek Smith, as you mentioned, Boye Mafe, they have that type of potential. I'm not willing to put my job on the line. The proverbial gun to your head, which I don't love that expression, but still, my point is, I'm not sure there's any one of Seattle's pass rushers that I would put my name on the line and say, this guy is guaranteed to be an 8.5, 9, 10 sack guy next year. I think Uchenna Nwosu is going to be able to do that. He definitely showed that last year. I think Darrell Taylor is going to be able to take the potential that he has flashed various times over the last couple of seasons, and definitely last year, the second half of the season, he got hot. And I am hopeful for the Seahawks, for Darrell Taylor, that he is going to be able to continue. I just don't know for sure. And that to me is the biggest kind of question mark that I would say about that edge rusher class. But I 100% agree with you that I love their potential. I just worry about the production. I want to see the proof is in the pudding, as I often say. And I think that the Seahawks have to be able to demonstrate that they have 6 good pass rushers, very good potentially, rather than 6 average guys that we are just being led to believe because of the high draft picks, the salary cap dollars that Seattle, kind of provided Uchenna Nwosu, that they have to be able to live up to those high draft picks and that contract if Seattle is going to be able to take that next step, go from being a playoff contender, obviously, got the wild card this past season, but now the expectation is that they're going to be a playoff team. Can they do that this upcoming season? That to me is going to be one of the most fascinating questions on the defensive side of the ball.
You're not as high on the outlook for the edge rushers. You mentioned the safety group being a positive. So I'm going to dish it back to you from a long-term perspective. I love the talent that the Seahawks have at safety, but this is every position has a different cup of tea. And for me, I look at the crippling cap hits coming up next year. You've got Quandre Diggs and Jamal Adams carrying cap hits north of $20 million in 2024. You've got the durability, the age concerns. Adams has missed more than 20 games the last 2 seasons. Diggs is going to be 31 next year. And then there's the lack of club control. Adams and Jarek Reed II, their 6th-round pick. Rob, those are the only 2 guys that are under contract through the 2024 or 2025 season. Even Julian Love's going to be free agent after 2024. So I don't see as much club control there. I see these bloated contracts. In the case of Adams, can he play to that level coming back from injury? Maybe that changes this discussion, but I have long-term concerns. If everybody is healthy this year, I think that could maybe be the best position group on the entire football team, the safety position. There's some big what ifs there, though, and I just look in 2024, 2025, and, if Jarek Reed II ends up hitting, this becomes a much different conversation, but it just seems like there are going to be a lot of question marks beyond this year, and most of them probably are going to be surrounding number 33, depending how this season plays out. So for me, the safety position, I'm not near as high on as what you are long-term, even though I like the talent they have at that position. I think one thing that we can agree on, though, because this has maybe been the most we've disagreed on a segment in a long time. I think the one thing that we can agree on, at least from a perspective here, is that the defensive line, the interior defensive line, that is truly a wait and see proposition, because there's reasons to be excited long-term, and there's also reasons to go, whoa, wait a second. I'm not sure what they're doing here with this interior defensive line.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I really think that long-term and short-term defensive tackle, nose guard, whatever you want to call it, those interior defensive linemen, the big guys, and, we're taking a macro approach, and I think that that Seattle has, still has some work to do at that position, and I think that they feel the same way. I think that the number of players that they've signed since the draft indicates their concern in terms of being able to slow the run. But I'll tell you that one of the things I'm most excited about, and we already kind of talked about, Dre'Mont Jones. I love the bringing back Jarek Reed. I think that it does add an element of physicality and toughness and positional versatility and just experience that I think that the Seahawks needed. We talked before about how much I think Seattle may miss like a guy like Al Woods or a guy like a Poona Ford. I think that Jarek Reed does solve some of those issues. And then I love Cameron Young. I mean, he was one of the Seahawks that as a rookie I projected Seattle to select, because I just really thought that he was kind of the perfect fit for them in a lot of different ways, kind of that blue collar guy. But at the same time, again, I just think that asking a rookie to come in and play at that nose guard position, as I think the Seahawks are going to ask Young to do, is a lot to ask. And especially considering just the level of success of the running games, again, that I think that Seattle has to be able to defend if they want to move up in that playoff hierarchy. If you were going to be able to get by the San Francisco 49ers, the Philadelphia Eagles, you really have to be able to play really sound defense. I'm not so sure that Seattle has the big boys in the middle to be able to do that just yet.
Yeah, that's the real question, is the nose guard, the nose tackle position. Mm-hmm. What is the long-term and short-term prognosis at that position? If you hit on Cameron Young, then that changes things. But Brian Monet, he's under contract for the next couple of years, but what's he going to look like whenever he gets back from this ACL injury that he had surgery to repair? And, if you've got Miles Adams playing some nose tackle at under 300 pounds, that's probably not the ideal situation. So you look at depth, you look at the nose tackle position, and there are concerns there. But then you've got Dre'Mont Jones under contract for 3 years, Jarek Reed for 2 years. I think Mike Morris has a chance to be a day 3 steal for them playing inside as well. You've got intriguing pieces to build around, and there's continuity, as I mentioned earlier, that they really haven't had in the interior defensive line. So that truly is a wait and see across that defensive line. You're listening to the Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined as always by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. For our everydayers out there, you'll want to listen to tomorrow. Dan Viennes of the Seahawks Forever podcast will be joining us to discuss his deep sleeper candidates. And we'll also be looking at Geno Smith's ceiling and much more. Going to be a really exciting episode that you will not want to miss. let's continue our 90-man countdown. Rob, this will be the first time that you get to be involved in this. I kick things off on our Monday show with numbers 90 through 86. We get 85 through 81. You and I are going to rotate some of these players, maybe get to talk about some of these guys, both of us getting to chime in. But this is truly going to be a chance for us to talk about the ones that we're really excited about. And so let's start with number 85 here. And I know this is a player, he has one trait that always pops off the film, or in the case, pops off the track, that teams are really enamored by. And that is Benji Franklin, who actually played in the preseason for the Jacksonville Jaguars last year.
Yeah, this is a cornerback who, as you mentioned, played with the Jacksonville Jaguars, actually spent a little bit of time with the Green Bay Packers as well, played his college ball at Tarleton State. Not a big time college program, but they've actually produced a fair number, of NFL prospects over the years. And this guy was absolutely dominant at Tarleton State. And so that to me is one of the things that I'm most intrigued by, is that, just the playmaking ability that he has. Over his final 3 seasons at Tarleton State, this kid intercepted 8 passes, had 27 passes broken up, had a couple of block kicks. He was absolutely spectacular on special teams. He is a 4.33 guy. You mentioned the straight line speed. Absolutely unbelievable athlete. I don't know that he has the physicality that you need to have at the NFL level. But I think that he realizes now that he's had his 2 tours in the NFL, as we mentioned before, Jacksonville and Green Bay. I like the way that he fits into Seattle's system. I like the pure athletic ability. And again, I think that he recognizes that if he is going to be able to play in the NFL, then he's going to have to be more physical against the run. That was the biggest concern I had about him. He's a 180-pound player, Corbin, and we know that Seattle just absolutely requires physicality at the cornerback position. If he can demonstrate that, his ability on special teams, his straight line speed, his ball skills, he doesn't have those 32-inch arms and some of the other traits that Seahawks fans have grown accustomed to with all the Seattle's corners, but he does have playmaking ability and straight line speed. And those 2 attributes are enough to get you in the NFL. And so I'm really excited to see what he is going to be able to show here during training camp.
Let's give this podcast some Pacific Northwest flavor, shall we? Coming in at number 84, I call him the jitterbug. And we've used that term for a few other guys, but watching Oregon State's film, and Tyjon Lindsey is the textbook definition of a jitterbug. And he's 5'8", 172 pounds, soaking wet. This guy he's as tiny as you're going to find for receivers. I actually see a little bit of Jakeem Grant, although he doesn't have the kick and punt return experience. I see a similar body style, similar quickness. He tested really well. And this is not a guy that is coming into the league without any foundation as a receiver, Rob. He had 30 catches for over 300 yards and a couple of touchdowns. He also had a rushing touchdown last year. So this is a guy that has a little bit about that multifaceted gadget to him, where you can run the ball with him a little bit. You can move him in motion. You can run jet sweep fakes. You can do toss back screens to him. There's a lot of different things. But if Lindsey is going to have any chance to make this team again, he did not return kicks and punts very often at Oregon State. They didn't ask him to do that. But at that size, he's a really good athlete with elite quickness. If you want to make a run at a roster spot for this football team, you got to show Pete Carroll and Larry Izzo and company that you can return kicks and punts. If he is able to do that, then maybe this is a guy that we talk about deep into training camp, maybe pushing for a roster spot. If that is not something that develops, though, it's going to be pretty darn hard for him to be able to make this team, especially with the receiving talent they have at his size and not being a guy that was overly productive for the Beavers. Speaking of productivity, and I know that this is a player that you've been chomping at the bit to talk about. In fact, you mentioned him earlier in the show. First team all XFL selection for the Seattle Sea Dragons, and he gets to stay in Seattle. He's recovering from knee surgery, but from what I've been told, he's got a good chance to be back early in training camp for the Seahawks. And Austin Faleu has a chance to maybe fit into that nose tackle battle behind Cameron Young once the action starts up in August.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's kind of fun. We're transitioning from Oregon State with Tyjon Lindsey, the wide receiver, to the University of Oregon, Austin Feleu, the big defensive tackle. And as you mentioned, Corbin, he was, a very productive player for the Sea Dragons. It was. It was interesting to watch Seattle go that route, because Filu is a player that I watched the University of Oregon. I mean, he was a starter going back to his freshman year, but it wasn't until his senior season, the last 5-6 games of the year, where he really became a dominant player. And I was surprised, frankly, when he wound up not getting drafted. But did spend some time with the Dallas Cowboys. Actually had a game appearance a year ago, and then again went to the Sea Dragons. He's a little bit undersized considering the way that Seattle. I think that most of us are kind of assuming that Seattle might be looking along that defensive line. 6'3", 295 pounds to 300 pounds roughly. But again, not that big 330-pound space eater that I think a lot of Seahawks fans right now might be clamoring for. But this is a guy who does have some quickness to him, does coordinate his hands and his legs very well to be able to create some pressure, and he's powerful. I think that he is still just kind of scratching the surface of his potential. So, the Sea Dragons are, their top scout is Randy Mueller, who was in the NFL with the Seahawks and elsewhere for a long, long time. Randy Mueller helped create one heck of a roster for the Sea Dragons. Saw Randy Mueller actually during the Seahawks minicamp. I think he was watching Austin Feleu, and I understand why, because I think that we might be seeing a player that went from the Sea Dragons now going to the Seahawks, who is going to be able to kind of resurrect a pretty promising NFL career.
For better or worse, this next player in our countdown, coming in at number 82, is going to conjure up some memories of Tom Cable. But, maybe let's give you a better memory. It also gives memories of George Fant, who played a lot of good snaps for the Seattle Seahawks as a sixth offensive lineman. And that would be Kendall Randolph, who played for the Alabama Crimson Tide. And what's interesting about Randolph is that he actually was a tight end for most of his college career. And so we're talking a 285 to 295 pound tight end. He was a pure blocking tight end. He doesn't have any catches. He doesn't have any trip ups short of the first down marker like George Fant did in that game against the Minnesota Vikings a few years back. So he hasn't had to worry about that, but he's gotten a lot of snaps playing for Nick Saban's offense as a tight end. He's played a handful of snaps as a tackle as well. So this guy is clearly going to be a project because he hasn't played a lot of snaps along the offensive line, but he's played the tight end position. He was a 4-star recruit. I mean, most of the guys that go to Alabama, they've got 4 and 5-star labels. So he's got the pedigree, a guy that has been touted for his work ethic as well. This is a player I don't think makes this football team, but as a practice squad candidate, especially with Stone Forsythe only having 2 years left on his rookie deal, Jake Curhan's going to be a restricted free agent in a year. This gives the Seahawks a chance to develop a player who does have athletic traits. He has ideal size. You add another 10 pounds to him where he could be a swing tackle in the NFL and potentially be on this roster in 2024. He also gets after it if you watch the film. This guy's got some physicality to him, which is why Alabama ran a lot of 6 offensive line sets where they had this extra tight end in the lineup helping out. So get some George Fant vibes there. He's further along than George Fant because he's actually played a lot more playing in the SEC for Alabama, but still not a lot of snaps as an offensive lineman necessarily. So there is going to be a bit of a learning curve here. And real quick to cap off our second segment here of 90-player countdown, let's talk about a player I know that you and I both want to get some thoughts in here. And that would be Ty Okada, who played at Montana State. And this guy is the textbook definition of a player who plays with his hair on fire. I've been watching Montana State. I've looked at a couple games, and there's been a few injuries sprinkled in there. But you want to talk about a guy that flies to the football and gets his hands on the football a lot. For an undrafted rookie, Okada's got some really fun film.
He really does. You mentioned before the Alabama player and Kendall Randolph, who came in as a 4-star recruit. Ty Okada was, a guy that basically kind of fell under the radar because he played his high school ball at quarterback in the state of Minnesota. And to wind up going to Montana State, where he made that transition to the defensive side of the ball. Last couple of years, he has primarily played safety and nickelback, was not invited to the combine, Corbin, but at his pro day ran in the 4.4s, really showed off his explosiveness in the leaping drills and his change of direction. He is a very productive player in terms of special teams, and has some ball skills to him as well. And he is more of that kind of classic Seahawk size at 5'11", 200 pounds with good arm length. And again, really intriguing athletic ability. I think with the defensive back depth that the Seahawks have, I think that Ty Okada at this point has to be a little bit of a long shot to make this roster, but he's got the kind of mentality, the positional versatility that you're always looking for. And so again, another player that I'm very, very intrigued by. And to me, kind of actually reminds me a little bit of, Reed Blankenship. I think it was Reed Blankenship of a year ago. No, I'm sorry, not Reed Blankenship, but the safety from Virginia that actually wound up making the team.
Joey Blunt.
Exactly. Thank you. Joey Blunt, that, he's got some playmaking ability that is obvious on tape. And so to me, that is one of the things that is really intriguing to me. I apologize. I mentioned Reed Blankenship. He was an undrafted free agent that made the Philadelphia Eagles roster a year ago, similar to Joey Blunt, undrafted free agent for University of Virginia, making Seattle's roster. Ty Okada is a player that I'm really intrigued about. And again, I think that Seattle has a number of undrafted free agents. We talked about this earlier in the year, that I think it could make this training camp a fascinating one. We talked so much about Seattle's draft class. It's the undrafted rookies, Ty Okada being one of them, Kendall Randolph again being another one, that I think could make Seattle's draft class much, much better than just the 10 players they selected.
I'm glad that you mentioned the athletic metrics, because that's really what popped out first to me. I believe he had a top 10 relative athletic score at the safety position for this draft class coming from Montana State. And then you look at the productivity, an interception, 9 pass breakups, over 70 tackles last year. This guy comes up and hits you. He can play in the box. He's played some single high too. So he's got some positional versatility. He's played a little bit in the slot, not something he's done extensively, but he can play there as well. And then you have that 4.4 speed. You've got the explosiveness, the really quick 3-cone time as well. So he's got change of direction skills. Really, the only question for him is adapting from the FCS level to the NFL. And he just happens to be in a really good position group at safety. But as I mentioned earlier, there might be some big changes coming depending on how this year plays out at that position next year, with some of the money and other things going on at that safety position. Okada could be a player that they redshirt on the practice squad this year if he has a really good training camp and exhibition season. And then next year, him and Jarek Reed, you could have 2 guys that can play both safety positions that could be potentially competing for some snaps on defense, depending what the Seahawks decide to do at that spot. So he is a name that I'm going to have circled that I'm going to be watching closely, because I do think he's one of those under the radar undrafted players that could make some waves for the Seahawks in the month of August. As always, you can follow me on Twitter at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Subscribe and follow Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you listen to your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. Coming up tomorrow, Dan Fienza of the Seahawks Forever podcast will be joining us to talk about deep sleepers to make the roster, Geno Smith's ceiling with all the weapons around him, and much more. It's going to be a jam-packed episode. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for listening in, and enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. Go Hawks.